My name is Mia. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of woman people describe with words like steady, practical, or low maintenance. I work a quiet, analytical job. I keep routines. I notice details. I don't take up much space in a room unless I'm invited to. People often mistake that for simplicity, or softness, or, if I'm being honest, irrelevance. I've been underestimated in boardrooms, at family dinners, and inside my own marriage. Not because I lacked intelligence or strength, but because I didn't perform it loudly. I didn't demand attention. I didn't narrate my thoughts in real time. I learned early that staying observant kept me safer than staying expressive. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about winning. And it definitely isn't about becoming someone louder or crueler than I ever was. It's about what happens when a woman who has been quietly paying attention realizes she was never as powerless as everyone assumed. What you're about to hear unfolds slowly. There are no dramatic confrontations, no screaming matches, no cinematic explosions of truth. Instead, there's a gradual emotional shift, one that begins with unease, moves through clarity, and ends in a kind of stillness I didn't know was possible. At the center of it all is my marriage. From the outside, it looked ordinary, comfortable, even boring. Inside, it was built on small assumptions about who I was, what I would tolerate, and how invisible my boundaries really were. There came a moment when those assumptions cracked. I found out my spouse had taken out a $2 million life insurance policy on me. That sentence sounds dramatic when stated plainly. It sounds like the beginning of a thriller or a story fueled by paranoia. But this isn't that kind of telling. What mattered wasn't just the policy itself, it was the timing, the intention, and the way everything around it began to subtly rearrange. Because the policy update arrived the same week, our marriage suddenly improved. If you're expecting a tale of rage or public exposure, this won't give you that. What it will give you is an honest account of how emotional justice can unfold without spectacle, how silence can become a deliberate choice rather than a forced one, and how quiet dominance doesn't look like control over others, it looks like control over yourself. I'm sharing this not to warn you against love, or marriage, or trust. I'm sharing it because many of us, especially women who move gently through the world, are taught that awareness must always be paired with confrontation to matter. That isn't true. Sometimes the most profound reversals happen internally first. Sometimes the most powerful shift is deciding not to explain yourself anymore. As you listen, you may recognize pieces of your own life here. Moments you dismissed, details you noticed but didn't name, feelings you told yourself were too small to justify action. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Have you ever sensed something was wrong long before you could prove it, and wondered what it might mean if you trusted that feeling? To most people in my life, I was dependable background noise, not in an insulting way, at least not on the surface. I was the one who remembered dates, paid bills on time, smoothed over awkward moments, and absorbed inconvenience without comment. If something needed handling quietly, it came to me. If something went wrong, I was expected to adapt. In my marriage, this role fit me so seamlessly that no one ever questioned it, including me. My husband used to say I was easy to be married to. He meant it as praise. What he meant was that I didn't ask many questions, didn't make emotional demands, and didn't disrupt the rhythm of his life. I didn't fight for control because I didn't appear to want it. Friends saw me as grounded. Family described me as low drama. At gatherings, I was the listener, the observer, the one people talked at rather than with. When decisions were made, they were rarely hostile toward me. They just didn't require my input. I was useful. And usefulness, I learned early, can look a lot like respect if you don't stare at it too closely. At work, I was known for being thorough, quietly competent, the kind of person managers trusted with sensitive information, but never worried would challenge authority. I sat in meetings taking notes while louder voices filled the room, and afterwards someone would ask, "What did you think?" As if the thinking only began once I was prompted. I didn't correct them. That invisibility followed me home. In our marriage, I handled logistics. He handled narratives. If something felt off, I told myself it was normal. Relationships had phases. Stress ebbed and flowed. Love didn't need constant interrogation to be real. When my needs surfaced, they did so gently. So gently they were easy to miss. And because I didn't escalate, no one adjusted. There's a particular kind of erasure that doesn't come from cruelty, but from assumption. The assumption that you will always be fine, that you don't mind, that your silence is agreement rather than restraint. I didn't see myself as a victim. That's important to say. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't trapped. I was simply unseen in a way that felt strangely mutual, as if we'd all agreed, without ever speaking, that my inner life was an optional context. Looking back, I realize how carefully I maintained that image. I answered questions efficiently. I expressed concerns in measured tones. I avoided emotional language because I didn't want to seem dramatic or needy. I told myself this was maturity. But there were moments, small, almost forgettable ones, where I felt the shape of something missing. Decisions made without me. Jokes that landed a second too sharp. Compliments that focused on how little I required. Each time, I adjusted inwardly instead of outwardly. People tend to think invisibility happens to you, that it's imposed. What they don't talk about is how often it's co-created, how silence, once rewarded, becomes a habit, how being easy becomes an identity. I was proud of how little I needed. I didn't demand reassurance. I didn't ask to be centered. I didn't insist on being understood. And because of that, no one ever worried about what I noticed. No one wondered what I remembered. No one imagined I might be paying attention in a way that wasn't passive. If you had asked anyone who knew us, they would have described our marriage as stable, calm, predictable. They would have said I was lucky, that I had found someone uncomplicated. They would have said I was safe. What they wouldn't have said, what never crossed their minds, was that safety can sometimes look exactly like stagnation when you're the one carrying all the quiet adjustments. I didn't yet know that this version of myself, the agreeable, observant, emotionally economical woman, was being carefully filed away in someone else's mental ledger. But I was already there, labeled, assessed, underestimated. And at the time, I still believed that being underestimated was harmless. The first moment didn't feel important at the time. That's why I remember it so clearly now. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening, the kind that barely registers when you think back on a marriage. Dinner dishes are drying in the rack, the soft hum of the dishwasher. My husband was scrolling on his phone while I reviewed a document for work at the kitchen table. He mentioned, casually, almost as an afterthought, that he'd made a small financial decision that day. Nothing major, he said, just something he handled so we wouldn't have to worry about it later. I remember looking up and asking evenly, "Oh, what kind of decision?" He didn't look at me when he answered, just shrugged and said, "Stuff you don't need to stress about." It wasn't the content of the dismissal that caught my attention. It was the confidence with which it was delivered, as if my involvement would have been an inconvenience, as if my curiosity itself was unnecessary labor he was sparing me from. I smiled, nodded, went back to my screen. That was the cut. Not because he withheld information. People do that all the time without meaning harm. But because in that moment, I felt myself being quietly categorized. Not as a partner, not as a peer, but as someone whose awareness was optional. No one else noticed it. If I'd mentioned it to a friend, they would have laughed and said, "That's just how some people are with money." If I'd brought it up to him, he would have apologized lightly, told me I was reading into it. So I didn't bring it up. But I noted it. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, replaying the tone rather than the words. The way he'd said you don't need to stress about it, as if stress was my defining feature, as if protection and exclusion were the same thing. In the weeks that followed, similar moments appeared. Small, dismissible, easy to explain away if you wanted to keep the peace. He'd make plans that involved my time without asking first. He'd answer questions on my behalf in conversations. He'd summarize my opinions in ways that were close, but not quite accurate. Each time, people smiled, conversations moved on, nothing happened, except something did. I began to feel like I was watching myself be edited in real time. My complexity was trimmed for convenience. My silence is interpreted as consent. What made it confusing was that none of this was cruel. There was no anger in it, no overt disrespect, just a subtle redirection of agency, repeated often enough that it started to feel intentional. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself this was normal marital drift, that long-term relationships naturally simplify roles, that someone had to be the steady one, and I'd always been good at that. Still, my body reacted before my mind did. I became more alert in conversations, more precise in my listening. I started remembering exact phrases, not because I planned to use them, but because something in me wanted accuracy. I didn't argue. I didn't assert. I didn't change my behavior outwardly at all. In fact, I became even easier. That's the part people don't understand. When you sense a boundary being crossed quietly, sometimes the instinct isn't to push back. It's to observe more carefully, to gather information, to understand the pattern before naming it. Everyone else continued as if nothing had shifted. Friends still called me lucky. Family still praised our stability. My husband still thought of himself as considerate, even protective. And I let him, because at that stage, I wasn't ready to call it what it was. I didn't yet have language for it. All I had was a growing awareness that something small had changed direction, and that once something changes direction, it doesn't return on its own. That first small cut didn't bleed, it didn't scar, but it taught me where the blade was. Once you survive the first small cut without reacting, the world around you learns something. It learns that this level of treatment is acceptable, not because you said so, but because nothing happened. The moments that followed weren't identical, but they rhymed. Decisions made for us, without discussion. Information is shared selectively, often after the fact. A growing habit of speaking around me instead of to me. What unsettled me wasn't the behavior itself, it was how quickly it became ordinary. I found myself filling in the gaps automatically, explaining his choices to me before he ever had to, interpreting his tone generously, translating dismissal into care. He's just tired. He's under pressure. He means well. I had a whole internal committee devoted to preserving harmony. And because I didn't resist, the pattern refined itself. He stopped checking in. I stopped expecting it. He framed decisions as solutions. I framed my discomfort as overthinking. We both benefited from the illusion that nothing was wrong. Outwardly, I was still the calm one, the reasonable one, the wife who didn't nag or question. Inwardly, something else was happening. I started to notice how often my silence was being used as evidence of agreement. How frequently my absence from a conversation was interpreted as disinterest rather than exclusion. How easily my adaptability became a resource others felt entitled to spend. At social gatherings, he'd recount stories about us that felt slightly misaligned with my memory. Not false, just incomplete in a way that centered him as the actor and me as the supporting detail. People laughed, nodded, moved on. I smiled along, but I felt a quiet detachment settling in, like watching a version of your life being narrated by someone else and realizing you've stopped correcting the record. That detachment frightened me more than anger would have. Anger would have meant I still believed confrontation could restore balance. Detachment meant I was beginning to accept that balance had never been the goal. I normalized it by shrinking my expectations. I told myself partnership didn't require equal visibility, that love didn't need constant calibration, that I was strong enough not to need acknowledgement. There's a particular kind of pride that grows in women who endure without complaint. It's subtle. It whispers that needing less makes you better, that being unaffected is a virtue. I wore that pride like armor, but armor gets heavy when you never take it off. I noticed I was speaking less about myself, not because I had nothing to say, but because I'd learned it didn't land anywhere. I offered fewer opinions, asked fewer questions, let conversations drift past me. And the more I receded, the more others filled the space. My husband became more confident in his assumptions. Friends stopped checking in. Family praised my patience. No one asked if I was choosing silence or being trained into it. The most disorienting part was how reasonable everything seemed. There was always a justification, a context, a way to make my discomfort feel impractical. I wasn't being yelled at. I wasn't being threatened. I wasn't being controlled in any obvious way. I was simply being bypassed. And because I'd spent so long being useful, being bypassed felt like a failure on my part rather than a violation of partnership. So I adapted again. I refined my calm. I made myself smaller emotionally, not out of fear, but out of efficiency. If something didn't register, I stopped offering it. If my presence wasn't required, I treated that as a relief. But inside, I was keeping track. Not in a bitter way, not with an agenda, just with clarity. Patterns are my profession. I see them whether I want to or not. And what I saw emerging wasn't chaos. It was structure, a role I was being quietly fitted into. Reliable, flexible, non-obstructive, invisible. And still, I told myself this was normal, that marriages evolve, that this was the cost of stability, that asking for more would be indulgent. I didn't yet realize how dangerous normalization can be. Not because it hurts, but because it teaches others exactly how far they can go without consequence. By the time I recognized that truth, the role had already solidified, and I was playing it flawlessly. It didn't happen all at once. Roles like this never do. They form through repetition, through what you accept, what you smooth over, what you don't interrupt. Over time, expectation hardens into identity. I became the reliable one. Not just dependable in the practical sense, but emotionally predictable. I was expected to be calm, to be reasonable, to absorb change without destabilizing anyone else's plans. If something needed adjusting, it was assumed I would adjust. And I did, because I was good at it. If a schedule shifted, I rearranged my day. If a decision was made late, I adapted. If information arrived after the fact, I processed it quietly. People began to treat this flexibility as my defining feature rather than a choice I was making. In my marriage, this role was reinforced constantly, often unconsciously. My husband would say things like, "You're so easy to deal with," or "I don't have to worry about you freaking out." These were compliments in his mind, proof that I was different from other women he'd known. What he didn't realize, or perhaps never considered, was that ease for one person often means effort for the other. I noticed how my reactions were anticipated before I even had them. If something inconvenient happened, he'd move forward, assuming I'd be fine. If something required sacrifice, it was quietly allocated to me. Not because he asked, because that's what the role required. At family events, I was the buffer. The one who mediated tension without acknowledgement. The one who remembered preferences and managed logistics. If someone forgot something, I filled the gap. If someone overstepped, I softened the impact. People relied on me without ever really seeing me. And because I didn't protest, the reliance deepened. What struck me later was how little curiosity there was about my inner world. No one asked what I wanted long term. No one wondered how decisions landed with me emotionally. The assumption was that I was fine because I always appeared to be. I had trained them well. There's a strange loneliness in being considered low maintenance. It means people rarely check the foundation. They assume it's solid because it doesn't complain. In truth, I wasn't unhappy. I wasn't even resentful yet. I was simply aware that my value was being measured by how smoothly I absorbed other people's choices. Aware that my steadiness was being used as permission rather than appreciation. And aware that if I ever stopped performing this role, it would be seen as a deviation, an inconvenience, rather than a correction. That realization landed quietly without drama. I remember standing in the kitchen one morning, making coffee, listening to my husband talk about plans he'd made that involved my time. He spoke with certainty, as if my agreement was already secured by habit. I didn't interrupt him, but something in me paused, not in anger, in recognition. I saw the outline of the role clearly for the first time. The dependable wife, the emotional constant, the one whose presence stabilized everything without needing anything in return. It wasn't a role I'd consciously accepted, but I'd been rehearsing it for years. And once you see a role for what it is, you can't unsee it. The most unsettling part wasn't that others expected this of me. It was that I'd begun to expect it of myself. I'd internalized the idea that my needs were optional, that my discomfort was a personal inconvenience rather than shared responsibility. I told myself that being needed was enough. But being needed isn't the same as being known. Standing there with my coffee cooling in my hands, I understood something important. Roles are only stable as long as they go unquestioned. The moment you become aware of them, they start to loosen. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a change. I simply stopped assuming the role was permanent. And that was the first moment, though I didn't name it then, when the balance began to shift. The day something shifted didn't arrive with urgency. There was no argument, no discovery, no dramatic line of dialogue that changed everything. It was quiet enough that I almost missed it. I was sitting alone in my car, parked on a side street near our house, engine off. I'd just returned from a routine appointment. Nothing emotional, nothing significant. The kind of errand that doesn't deserve reflection. But instead of getting out of the car, I stayed. I remember the light that afternoon. Flat. Overcast. The world muted in a way that made everything feel paused. I rested my hands on the steering wheel and realized I didn't feel rushed. That was new. For years, my internal clock had been synchronized to everyone else's needs. There was always something waiting for me, someone expecting my presence, my adjustment, my steadiness. That afternoon there wasn't, and in that stillness, a thought surfaced. Not fully formed, but persistent. What if I stopped preempting everyone else? Not leaving, not confronting, just not filling in the gaps automatically. The idea didn't feel rebellious. It felt logical, almost responsible. I thought back over the past few months, the normalized dismissals, the role I'd been assigned, the way my silence had been interpreted as consent. I saw the pattern clearly now, not as a personal failure, but as a system that functioned because I made it efficient. Systems don't collapse when you attack them. They change when you stop maintaining them. I sat there long enough for that truth to settle. Inside my chest, there was no anger, no surge of emotion demanding expression. Instead, there was a quiet recalibration, like something clicking into place. For the first time, I considered the possibility that silence didn't have to mean endurance. It could mean choice. I went inside the house afterward and moved through the evening as usual. Made dinner, listened, responded politely. Nothing outward changed, but internally, I stopped explaining things away. When my husband spoke over me later that night, I noticed it without justifying it. When a decision was mentioned as a fait accompli, I didn't rush to accommodate it mentally. I let the discomfort exist without dissolving it. That was the shift, not action. Awareness paired with restraint. In the days that followed, I practiced something new, not reacting immediately, not smoothing moments before they became awkward, letting pauses stretch longer than felt comfortable. It wasn't passive-aggressive, it wasn't strategic yet. It was experimental, and the response was immediate, though subtle. People leaned in when I didn't fill the silence. Conversations slowed, assumptions hesitated. My husband asked, "Everything okay?" One evening, his tone casual but alert. I smiled and said, yeah. Which was true, because something in me had finally stopped bracing. I wasn't planning an exit. I wasn't plotting anything. I was simply no longer volunteering my emotional labor on autopilot. That alone changed the energy. I began to see how much of my invisibility had been sustained by my own efficiency. How often I had preempted questions by being agreeable. How frequently I had softened edges before anyone else even noticed them. Letting those edges exist felt grounding. Not empowering in a dramatic sense, just stabilizing. I slept better that week. Not longer, but deeper. As if my body recognized that something had been rebalanced. I didn't yet know where this shift would lead. I hadn't identified leverage or made decisions. I hadn't imagined consequences. All I knew was that I was no longer operating from reflex. And once you stop reacting on instinct, you begin to see options you didn't know were there. That afternoon in the car didn't change my marriage overnight, but it changed me. And that, as it turns out, was far more disruptive than any confrontation could have been. Once silence stopped being my default, it became something else entirely. A tool, not a weapon, not a punishment. Just a deliberate pause where there used to be automatic accommodation. I didn't announce the change. I didn't frame it as growth or self-respect. I simply stopped rushing to close every gap. When my husband made assumptions, I let them hang. When plans were described instead of discussed, I asked neutral questions instead of rearranging my schedule in my head. When information arrived late, I acknowledged it without absorbing the inconvenience. This confused people, not enough to provoke confrontation, but enough to disrupt their expectations. The first few times, my husband filled the silence himself. He clarified, backtracked slightly, explained more than usual. It was as if my stillness created a vacuum he felt compelled to fill. He mistook it for weakness. I could see that clearly. He became gentler in tone, but firmer in direction, as if assuming I was fragile rather than intentional. He checked in superficially. "You okay with that?" Without actually waiting for a meaningful response. I said yes when it didn't matter, and when it did, I said, "I'll need time to think about it." That phrase changed everything. It wasn't confrontational, it wasn't emotional, it was procedural. And it unsettled him. At work, the shift had a similar effect. I stopped volunteering to take on extra tasks without discussion. I asked for clarification before agreeing. I let emails sit unanswered long enough to be processed rather than reacted to. People adjusted, slowly and uneasily. Silence, when chosen, has weight. What surprised me was how often it was misinterpreted. My calm was read as uncertainty. My restraint is passivity. My pauses were due to confusion. No one suspected intention, and that gave me room. Room to observe reactions without being pulled into them. Room to document rather than defend. Room to let patterns complete themselves instead of interrupting them prematurely. I began keeping more detailed notes, not emotional journals, but factual records, dates, statements, decisions, sequences. I didn't know yet why I was doing it, only that accuracy felt important. At home, my husband grew more attentive in ways that felt performative. Small gestures, compliments, offers of help that arrived just late enough to be visible. I accepted them politely, but I didn't relax, because I could feel something shifting beneath the surface, not in him, but in the dynamic. He was responding to a loss of predictability, not a loss of affection. And predictability, I realized, had been my real currency all along. When people rely on you to be consistent, any deviation feels like instability, even if it's healthy. I watched how quickly concern turned into subtle control, how questions were framed to elicit reassurance rather than understanding, how his confidence wavered when my reactions didn't follow their usual arc. Still, there were no accusations, no anger, just an adjustment, and I let him adjust. Silence gave me something else too, time to see how often I had been managing his comfort instead of my own clarity. Time to notice how rarely he asked questions that weren't about maintaining equilibrium. Time to recognize that his concern was triggered not by my discomfort, but by his uncertainty. That distinction mattered, because it told me exactly where the imbalance lived. By choosing silence, I had shifted the burden of interpretation back onto him, and without realizing it, he began revealing his assumptions. What he expected me to tolerate. What he thought I didn't notice. What he believed I would never challenge. I wasn't collecting ammunition, I was collecting truth. And the truth was unfolding naturally, without pressure. The most important thing I learned during this phase was that silence doesn't always de-escalate. Sometimes it clarifies. Sometimes it invites others to expose their own intentions without being prompted. I still loved my husband. That didn't disappear. But love, I was learning, doesn't require self-erasure. And clarity doesn't require noise. By the time I realized how much information my silence was yielding, the groundwork had already been laid. I just didn't know yet what I was standing on. What they never noticed was how much time silence creates when you stop spending it managing other people. Without the constant task of smoothing, adjusting, and reassuring, I found myself with long, uninterrupted stretches of mental clarity. Not leisure exactly, focus. The kind that sharpens perception instead of dulling it. I didn't announce this shift either. From the outside, I looked the same. Same routines, same tone, same willingness to engage when asked. But internally, I had begun preparing. Not for a confrontation, not for an escape, for understanding. I reviewed documents the way I always had, carefully, thoroughly, but now I did it with a different lens. I noticed patterns in our shared finances I'd previously trusted without verification. I cross-checked timelines, I read fine print without assuming benign intent. It wasn't suspicion, it was due diligence. At work, this was second nature to me. Risk isn't something you panic about, it's something you map. At home, I applied the same discipline. I noticed how often my husband referenced future security without specifics, how his language shifted subtly from we to I'll take care of it, how decisions framed as protective increasingly excluded collaboration. None of this was dramatic, but it was consistent. I also noticed something else, how little attention anyone paid to what I did with my time. My husband didn't track my schedule closely. Friends assumed I was always available, but never curious about how I filled my days. Family trusted me to handle details without oversight. Invisibility, I realized, has its advantages. No one questioned my need to organize files. No one wondered why I requested copies of statements. No one noticed when I asked clarifying questions about policies we already had covered. These were normal behaviors for someone like me. That's what made them powerful. I didn't act in secret. I acted in plain sight, protected by the assumption that I wasn't a threat to the existing order. I created folders, digital and physical, not hidden, just orderly. I labeled them clearly. I archived correspondence. I logged dates when decisions were mentioned versus when documentation appeared. Again, I didn't know exactly what I was preparing for. I only knew that clarity compounds. During this time, my husband's behavior continued its quiet evolution. He was more attentive, more present. Our conversations felt lighter. There was an ease that hadn't been there before. If you'd asked him, he would have said our marriage was improving. And in a way, it was. Because he felt less resistance. What he didn't feel was transparency. I had stopped offering my internal state as reassurance. I answered questions accurately, but minimally. I didn't volunteer interpretations. I didn't correct his assumptions unless they directly affected me. That restraint allowed his confidence to grow. And confidence reveals more than pressure ever does. He spoke more freely about plans, about contingencies, about what-if scenarios he'd previously glossed over. He framed them as practical, almost abstract. I listened. Not with fear, with attention. I also began having quieter conversations with myself about what I would do if the information I was gathering led somewhere uncomfortable, about whether knowing more would obligate me to act. I didn't rush those answers. Preparation isn't just about data, it's about emotional readiness. The deeper I went, the more I realized how much of my past silence had been mistaken for obliviousness. People assumed that because I didn't react, I didn't register. Because I didn't challenge, I didn't comprehend. That assumption had shaped every interaction, and now it was shielding me. I slept soundly during this phase. Not because everything was resolved, but because I felt aligned with myself for the first time in years. I wasn't suppressing intuition or overriding discomfort. I was simply observing reality as it was. One evening, as I sat at my desk organizing paperwork, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not relief, not satisfied. Readiness. I sensed that whatever I was moving toward, it would arrive on its own timeline. And when it did, I would be prepared. Not emotionally reactive, not morally confused. Just clear. What they never noticed was that while they saw my silence as absence, it had become presence. While they assumed I was disengaged, I was deeply attentive. And while they believed nothing had changed, the foundation was already being measured, stress-tested, and understood. Quietly, methodically, irreversibly. The discovery didn't arrive with shock. That surprised me most. It came folded into an ordinary afternoon, disguised as routine correspondence. One of those moments that would have passed unnoticed if I hadn't already learned to slow down and look closely. I was sorting through the mail at the kitchen counter. Utility bills, a bank notice, promotional envelopes I usually discarded without opening. Then one envelope gave me pause. It wasn't addressed to both of us. It was addressed to me. The return address was unfamiliar but formal, the kind that suggests institutions, not people. I opened it calmly, without expectation. Inside was a policy update. Not a new policy, an update. Language referencing changes, confirmations, and beneficiary alignment. It took me a moment to orient myself. And then I saw the figure, $2 million. My name was listed as the insured. My husband was listed as the policyholder. I read it once, then again, slowly. There was no spike of fear, no rush of adrenaline, just a steady narrowing of focus, the same sensation I'd felt countless times at work when a risk model suddenly revealed its true shape. This wasn't hypothetical. This was real, active, and intentional. What anchored me wasn't the amount, it was the timing. The policy update arrived the same week our marriage had suddenly improved. The gentleness, the attentiveness, the ease. Context matters. I sat down at the table and laid the pages flat, smoothing them with deliberate care. I checked dates, terms, riders, beneficiary clauses. Everything was clean, legal, thoughtfully constructed. This wasn't impulsive. It was planned. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask questions. I didn't let my breathing change. I folded the papers and placed them back in the envelope. Then I did something that might seem strange. I made tea. I needed my body to stay steady. Not dissociated, present. Because this wasn't the moment for reaction. This was the moment for comprehension. I replayed the past months in my mind, not with suspicion, but with alignment. The subtle shift in his behavior, the confidence, the renewed warmth, the future-oriented language. The insurance wasn't proof of malice on its own. People insure their spouses all the time. But secrecy paired with behavioral change isn't neutral. It's data. I didn't assume intent. That would have been reckless. Instead, I asked myself one question, the same one I'd ask in any professional assessment. Who benefits from this structure, and under what conditions? The answer was unambiguous. I felt a quiet clarity settle in, not dread, not rage. Recognition. This was the leverage I hadn't known I was preparing for. Not leverage in a manipulative sense, but leverage in the most literal one, a point where weight shifts outcomes. I spent the rest of the afternoon verifying what I could without alerting anyone. policy numbers, insurer legitimacy, dates of initiation. Everything checked out. Still, I told no one. Not a friend, not family, not even myself in a way, emotionally. I compartmentalized, because once something is spoken aloud, it demands a response, and I wasn't ready to respond. What I was ready to do was understand the full shape of the situation. That night, my husband was warm, engaged, present in a way that would have reassured me months earlier. He asked about my day. He laughed easily. He spoke about plans with confidence. I listened differently now. Not searching for guilt, not scanning for threat, just observing alignment. Nothing he said contradicted the facts. Nothing confirmed them either. And that was enough. When I went to bed, I slept. Deeply, because the unknown had resolved into something known, and knowledge, even uncomfortable knowledge, is stabilizing. The next morning, I placed the policy documents in my folder between records that already existed. I labeled the section neutrally. No dramatics, no secret compartments. Just order. The private reveal didn't change how I felt about myself. It clarified how carefully I needed to proceed. Whatever came next would need to be irreversible. Not emotionally explosive, not reactive. Deliberate. Because when someone has made a move this calculated, the most dangerous thing you can do is let them know you've noticed before you understand every angle. I had noticed, and I was still silent. Knowing something and deciding what to do with it are two very different experiences. After the policy became real, after it moved from abstraction to documented fact, I entered a period of deliberate stillness, not paralysis, evaluation. I didn't rush to label my husband's actions as malicious. That would have been emotionally satisfying, but strategically useless. I needed clarity, not narrative. So I laid out the options the way I always do when the stakes are high. Option 1. Confront him immediately. Ask why the policy existed, why I hadn't been included in the decision, and why the timing coincided with a sudden shift in his behavior. This would feel righteous. It would also collapse my visibility advantage instantly. Option 2. Tell someone else, a friend, a family member, seek validation, create witnesses. This would give me emotional relief. But it would also introduce noise, opinions, panic, pressure to act before I was ready. Option 3. Do nothing. Pretend I never saw it. Return to the old rhythm. This was the safest option on the surface and the most dangerous underneath. Once awareness arrives, willful ignorance becomes self-betrayal. Option 4. Proceed quietly. Verify everything. Protect myself legally and financially. Preserve normalcy while changing the structure beneath it. Only one of those options was irreversible in the right way. I chose the fourth. Not because I was afraid, but because I was finished reacting. That decision didn't feel dramatic. It felt clean. I remember writing it down, not as a declaration, but as a sentence fragment in my notebook. Proceed without announcement. That phrase became my anchor. From that point forward, every action I took was filtered through a single question. Does this increase my clarity or my exposure? If it increased exposure, I paused. If it increased clarity, I proceeded. I began consulting professionals in ways that appeared ordinary. I scheduled appointments under neutral pretenses. I asked questions hypothetically. I listened more than I spoke. I learned what protections already existed. I learned where gaps were. I learned what could be changed without triggering alarms. Each answer refined the shape of my path. Emotionally, I stayed steady. I didn't withdraw affection or create distance. I didn't punish or provoke. I maintained continuity. This wasn't deception. It was containment. At night, lying next to him, I felt no hatred. That surprised me too. What I felt was resolve, the kind that settles when you stop hoping circumstances will self-correct. He didn't sense the shift. Or if he did, he misread it as contentment. Our marriage, in his eyes, continued its upward trajectory. That illusion was useful. The hardest part of this phase wasn't fear, it was a restraint. There were moments when I wanted to ask direct questions, not to accuse, but to understand intent. I resisted, because intent reveals itself through structure more reliably than confession ever could. I reminded myself, you don't need answers, you need safeguards. This wasn't about proving anything, it wasn't about being right. It was about ensuring that whatever story others told about me later, it wouldn't be one of naivety. Once I committed to that path, something interesting happened. The anxiety I expected never arrived. In its place was focus. I woke up knowing exactly what I was doing and why. I moved through days without second-guessing myself. The mental noise quieted. That's when I understood something essential. Decisiveness doesn't always feel like power in the moment. Sometimes it feels like relief. The decision point wasn't a crossroads marked by emotion. It was a narrowing. From that moment on, there would be no impulsive conversations, no half measures, no attempts to restore a version of partnership that depended on my unawareness. Whatever happened next would happen because I allowed it, or because I had prepared for it. And preparation, once begun, does not reverse. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down and sharpened at the same time. Moving in silence doesn't mean freezing. It means choosing actions so ordinary they don't register as actions at all. I didn't change my routines. I didn't withdraw or become distant. If anything, I became more consistent. Predictability is disarming. It creates a sense of safety in people who rely on it. Behind that predictability, I began restructuring my life in ways that looked like maintenance. I reviewed our shared accounts under the guise of an annual organization. I requested updated statements for my records. I separated digital access points subtly, password updates, two-factor authentication, secure storage, things that would never raise suspicion in a marriage built on assumed trust. I didn't drain accounts, I didn't hide money. I clarified ownership. There's a difference. I also updated documents of my own. Not dramatically, no declarations, just quiet alignment between my values and my legal reality. If something happened to me, my voice would still be present in the structure left behind. That mattered. At the same time, I adjusted my professional life, not in response to fear, but in response to opportunity. I accepted a project that increased my autonomy. I repositioned myself financially, so my stability no longer depended on shared assumptions. None of this looked reactive. It looked like competence. At home, my husband continued his attentive phase. He cooked more. He checked in more often. He spoke about the future with confidence, vacations, plans, contingencies. I responded warmly but not expansively. I noticed how often he sought reassurance without asking for it directly. How frequently his gestures seemed designed to confirm that everything was back on track. And I let him believe that. Because what he didn't know was that the track itself was being rerouted. Silence protected me from having to perform emotions I didn't feel. I wasn't pretending affection, but I wasn't offering emotional transparency as a stabilizer anymore. That boundary was new and powerful. The most interesting part of this phase was how invisible it was. To everyone else, nothing was happening. No one checked in. No one asked questions. Invisibility once again worked in my favor. There were moments, late at night, alone, when I allowed myself to feel the weight of what I was doing. Not guilt, gravity. The understanding that once certain structures change, there's no returning to innocence. But innocence isn't the same as safety, safety. I reminded myself of that often. I also reminded myself that I wasn't harming anyone. I wasn't accusing. I wasn't exposing. I was simply ensuring that I would not be the only one unprotected in a system that already included contingencies for everyone else. That framing kept me grounded. Weeks passed. Then months. Nothing dramatic happened, and that was the point. Because by the time consequences arrive, they're rarely the result of one moment. They're the outcome of many quiet adjustments finally reaching their conclusion. I was no longer invisible in my own life. I was present, positioned, and prepared, and no one noticed. Consequences don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they arrive in confusion. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It was a pause, just a fraction longer than usual, when my husband realized something he expected to be easy wasn't easy. It started with small frictions, questions that no longer had immediate answers, assumptions that didn't resolve themselves the way they used to. He would mention something logistical and wait for me to fill in the rest. I didn't. At first, he laughed it off. "I thought you handled that," he'd say, casually. "I thought you had," I'd reply, just as casually. No accusation, no tension, just a neutral exchange that left the task where it belonged. That's when the unease began. Not anger, disorientation. He started double-checking things, asking follow-up questions, repeating himself in conversations, as if expecting a different response the second time. The emotional labor he hadn't realized I'd been carrying quietly returned to him, one responsibility at a time. And it didn't sit well. I noticed his tone shift, not harsher but tighter, less confident. He was still kind, still attentive, but there was a new undercurrent of uncertainty. He didn't know what had changed, only that something had. At work, similar patterns emerged. People who had once assumed my availability now had to wait. Requests came with more explanation. Decisions slowed. No one complained outright, but the ease was gone. And ease, I was learning, is often mistaken for entitlement once it disappears. What struck me most was how quickly discomfort was externalized. When things didn't move smoothly, people looked around for the missing piece, never at themselves. My husband grew restless. He talked more, filled silences with speculation, asked indirect questions meant to restore familiarity. "You've been quieter lately," he said one evening. I smiled. "I don't feel quieter." Which was true. I felt precise. The consequences weren't punitive. I wasn't withholding care or creating distance. I was simply no longer absorbing the imbalance. An imbalance, when left exposed, is uncomfortable to witness. He began expressing concern in ways that framed me as the variable. Was I stressed? Was something wrong at work? Did I need a break? I thanked him for his concern and told him I was fine. Because I was. The real loss wasn't emotional intimacy, it was control. The control that comes from predictability, from knowing how someone will respond before they do. That was gone. And its absence unsettled him more than any argument could have. He started revisiting past conversations, trying to locate the moment things shifted. He couldn't find it, because there hadn't been one. That's the thing about quiet change. It doesn't leave a timestamp. I watched this process with calm curiosity. Not satisfied, not guilt, just observation. I saw how quickly confidence eroded when it wasn't reinforced. How dependence revealed itself not through cruelty, but through confusion. The consequences weren't explosive. They were cumulative. Missed expectations, delayed resolutions, emotional static where there used to be flow. And still no one accused me of anything, because nothing I was doing was unreasonable. I wasn't refusing. I wasn't disappearing. I wasn't acting out of character. I was simply present in a way that required others to meet me where I actually was. That requirement, it turns out, is disruptive. By the time my husband began to sense that something couldn't be restored by reassurance alone, the structure had already shifted. The safety he felt, the ease, the certainty, was no longer guaranteed by my compliance. And without realizing it, he had stepped into a reality where consequences weren't imposed. They were revealed. By the time he realized something was truly wrong, he was already behind it. That's the nature of systems built on assumptions. They don't alert you when they begin to fail. They only make themselves known when your usual fixes stop working. He started trying to restore what he believed we had lost. More conversations, more check-ins, more gestures framed as care. He asked questions now, direct ones, but they came from urgency rather than curiosity. "Are we okay? Did I do something? Why do you feel so distant?" Each question assumed a problem that could be corrected with the right answer. I didn't rush to provide one, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I understood something he didn't yet. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a structural shift. You can't talk your way back into a system that no longer functions. I responded honestly, but narrowly. "I don't feel distant," I said. "I feel clear." That word unsettled him more than any accusation would have. Clarity implies permanence. He tried a different approach. Nostalgia. He referenced earlier years, how easy we used to be, how aligned. He framed the present as a temporary deviation from a shared norm. I listened without correcting the premise, because that version of ease had depended on my silence, and silence, once chosen consciously, doesn't return to being unconscious. He apologized vaguely, not for anything specific, just in case. He offered reassurance, promised attentiveness, spoke about teamwork, but he never asked what I needed now. He was trying to repair the past, not engage the present. I could feel his anxiety rising, not in panic, but in insistence. He wanted to do something, to fix, to restore, to regain the rhythm that no longer existed. What he didn't realize was that I wasn't withholding something that could be given back. I had reclaimed it. The more he pushed, the calmer I became. Not cold, grounded. That calm unnerved him. He suggested counseling, not as a mutual exploration, but as a solution, a way to return things to baseline. I told him I would think about it, which was true, because by then I understood that timing mattered more than intention. And whatever came next needed to be aligned with the reality I'd already secured, not the comfort he wanted restored. There was a night when he finally said it aloud. "I feel like I don't know where I stand with you anymore." I looked at him and said evenly, "I know." Not unkindly, not triumphantly, Just factually. That was the moment he realized he was no longer ahead of the narrative. The attempts to fix things continued for a while, cycling through affection, reassurance, self-reflection, and even self-blame. Each attempt assumed there was a switch that could be flipped. There wasn't, because what had changed wasn't my mood. It was my position. I had stopped being the stabilizer of everyone else's comfort. And without that stabilizer, the system couldn't rebalance itself. By the time he sensed that something irreversible had occurred, the conditions that allowed reversal were already gone. He hadn't noticed when I stopped absorbing. He hadn't noticed when I started choosing. And now, there was nothing left to negotiate. Only consequences to understand. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like a climax. It felt like a formality. We were sitting at the dining table, the same one where we'd shared years of meals, decisions, and unspoken assumptions. The room was quiet, not tense, just still. The kind of stillness that happens when there's nothing left to avoid. He spoke first. "I feel like you've already decided something," he said, "and I don't know what it is." His voice wasn't angry. It was careful, almost respectful in a way it hadn't been before. I nodded. "I have." That was all I said at first. I watched him absorb that. Not the words, but the certainty behind them. He searched my face for emotion he could respond to. He didn't find any urgency, any volatility. That unsettled him more than raised voices ever could. He asked me what had changed. I didn't list grievances. I didn't recount moments of dismissal or normalized disrespect. Those details would have invited debate, reinterpretation, and defense. Instead, I spoke about structure. I realized I was operating inside a system that only worked because I made myself smaller, I said. I don't do that anymore. There was no accusation in it, just description. He tried to interrupt, to explain, to contextualize. I let him finish. Then I continued. "I'm not angry, I'm not confused, and I'm not asking for reassurance. I'm telling you where I stand." That was when I saw panic flicker. Not fear of me, but fear of irrelevance, of not knowing how to re-enter the dynamic as it had been. He asked if this was about someone else, about stress, about something he could correct. I said no to all of it. Then I told him about the insurance policy. Not dramatically, not as a reveal, as a fact. "I received an update," I said. "A few months ago, a policy I didn't know existed." He froze. That was the only visible reaction he gave me. I didn't accuse him of intent. I didn't speculate out loud. I didn't demand an explanation. I simply said, "That kind of decision told me everything I needed to know about how I was being positioned in this marriage." He tried to explain. Of course he did. He said it was practical, that he meant well, that he was thinking ahead. I listened. Then I said, "Intent doesn't override structure." That ended the conversation more effectively than any argument could have. There was no shouting, no tears, no dramatic ultimatum. Just a clear line. I told him I would be moving forward in a way that prioritized my autonomy, my safety, and my clarity. That I wasn't interested in restoring what we had been, only in engaging with what was real. He asked if there was anything he could do. I told him the truth. No, not now. That wasn't punishment, it was timing. The confrontation didn't resolve anything emotionally. It didn't need to. Its purpose wasn't closure, it was acknowledgement. For the first time, he saw me not as predictable or easy or accommodating, but as decisive. And that recognition, quiet, unavoidable, changed the balance completely. I didn't leave the table feeling victorious. I left it feeling finished. Who I am now isn't a reaction to what happened. That's important to say. I didn't rebuild myself out of anger or betrayal. I didn't swing to the opposite extreme or armor myself against intimacy. What changed wasn't my personality. It was my orientation. I am no longer positioned around other people's comfort. That shift is quieter than people expect. There's no sharp edge to it, no visible hardness. If anything, I'm softer in ways that are finally honest. I still listen. I still notice details. I still move through the world with calm intention. But I no longer translate my silence into service for others. Silence for me now is spacious. After everything settled, after conversations ended, logistics rearranged, and assumptions dissolved, I noticed how much energy I had been spending just maintaining equilibrium. How much of my life had been organized around making things smooth. Letting go of that didn't create chaos. It created room. Room for curiosity. Room for discernment. Room for relationships that don't rely on me disappearing to function. I don't feel the need to explain myself as much anymore. Not because I'm closed off, but because I trust my internal signals. If something doesn't align, I don't negotiate it into acceptability. That's not dominance over others. That's self-respect practiced consistently. People interact with me differently now. Some are more careful, some are more present. A few drifted away when they realized the version of me they relied on no longer existed. I let them go without resentment, because I understand something now that I didn't before. Access isn't owed. It's earned through mutual regard. I think back to the woman I was at the beginning of this story, the one who believed being underestimated was harmless. She wasn't weak, she was unclaimed, by herself. Now, I claim my attention deliberately. I choose where it goes. I decide what I carry and what I don't. There's a steadiness that comes with that kind of ownership. Not flashy, not loud, reliable in a different way. If I could describe my life now in one word, it would be intentional. I don't rush clarity. I don't fill silences to soothe others. I don't confuse endurance with virtue. And I don't wait for permission to protect myself. What happened didn't make me cynical. It made me precise. I still believe in partnership, in love, in trust. But I also believe those things must be mutual to be real. I don't regret how quietly this unfolded. Loudness would have given me relief, but not integrity. Moving the way I did allowed me to stay aligned with my values, to act without becoming someone I don't recognize. That matters to me more than vindication ever could. Who I am now is someone who sees clearly and acts accordingly. And that, I've learned, is a form of dominance no one can take from you. There's a temptation, at the end of stories like this, to search for a villain. Someone to point at, someone to condemn, someone whose intent can be neatly labeled so the lesson feels clean. That's not what this is. What happened to me wasn't the result of a single malicious act. It was the outcome of a dynamic that rewarded silence, normalized assumption, and mistook accommodation for consent. Those systems don't collapse because someone is bad. They persist because someone is quiet. For a long time, that someone was me. The moral of this story isn't to trust or don't love. It's this: awareness is not aggression, and restraint is not weakness. You are allowed to notice patterns without explaining them away. You are allowed to gather information without announcing it. You are allowed to protect yourself without showing anger, so others take you seriously. Quiet dominance doesn't look like control. It looks like discernment. It looks like choosing when to speak and when to observe. Like letting other people reveal themselves through consistency rather than confrontation. Like acting in alignment with your values, even when no one is watching. I didn't win anything here. I preserved myself. And that distinction matters. If you take anything from this story, let it be this: if your calm is being used as permission rather than appreciation, something is out of balance. And balance doesn't return just because you endure longer. Sometimes, the most ethical thing you can do is stop making things easy for people who never asked how hard it was for you. You don't owe visibility to those who rely on your invisibility. You don't owe access to those who never learned to see you clearly. And you don't owe an explanation to systems that only function when you stay silent. If you've ever felt underestimated, overlooked, or quietly repositioned in someone else's narrative, I want you to know this: noticing doesn't make you unkind. Choosing yourself doesn't make you cold. It makes you honest. And honesty, practiced without spectacle, is one of the most powerful forms of self-respect there is. I'm curious to hear from you. Have you ever realized, slowly and without drama, that your silence was being mistaken for agreement? And if so, what changed when you stopped filling the space? Thank you for listening.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.